So thank you very much for the introduction. So yeah, I'm located in South Africa since 2014, looking after over 30 countries with my team, Sub-Saharan Africa. So while we're talking about success factors in South Africa, let's talk a little bit more of Southern Africa to broaden the spectrum there. The video you saw was the second year after Mandela's memorial. So why did I show that video? I didn't want it to make your first interactive task too easy, because a lot of people, the first thing that comes to their mind when they think about South Africa is Madiba. And I didn't want it to make it that easy, so what I would like you to do is quickly thinking about the one thing, the first thing that comes into your mind when you think about South Africa, or let's broaden it, when you think about Africa. You got it? That one thought? So think about the reason why you had that first thought. What does it entail? And to make it now interactive, I would ask you to turn to your neighbor sitting next to you and quickly interchange that. So when I, after that, ask someone to share, you're not that shy anymore because you already shared your thought with someone else. So I'll give you a minute to quickly talk about what you thought first about South Africa. Here we go. All right, I hear a lot of energy in this room, which I very much like. So I always know that I can depend on the last row to share their thoughts first. So what about right there? What was your first thought thinking about South Africa? The one word that popped into your mind. Yes, you can go ahead. You don't need to look up behind you. Okay. Development?
So I'm a student at Zeppelin University, studying politics in general, and so I have many connections to subject development in general, but Africa more specifically.
Cool. Thank you so much for sharing. Who would go next? The one thought. Yes. Apartheid? Yeah. What else? Stability? What else? Say it again. Potential. Yes. Community. Excellent. Excellent. Yes. Mm-hmm. Great. I love those first thoughts. I think the last 2 days brought a lot of maybe different ways of looking at Africa, or South Africa, Southern Africa, because most of the times when you ask people about Africa or Southern Africa, you first get crime, corruption, all those nice things. And seeing that you come up with other words is actually very encouraging, because there are always two sides if you look at the African continent. Yeah? And this is exactly what enterprises are dealing with. Yeah? The good, the bad, and the ugly that we need to deal with in the environments that we're in. So the question today is really, how are we going to lead an enterprise in such an environment? And the words that you brought in are showing a lot of opportunities, but then also all the challenges that are there. So what I would like to do now in the presentation is, first of all, quickly looking at the environment that we're dealing with, because that's kind of, yeah, the area we need to deal with, the challenges in a lot of cases, to then look at very broadly the Rolls-Royce leadership model as a basis for our discussion, to then look and tie it in with some cultural dimensions, to also have a little bit of a comparison between what we, with a, let's say, German mind, come in, and what we actually find in the Bantu, the Southern African cultures. Are we good with that? Good, because you're going to be interactive later again, so pay attention. All right, the one big thing, the fundamental driver of a lot of megatrends is actually the population growth. And this is not specifically for Africa. However, this is where we're going to see one of the biggest growths in terms of population. So in 2010, there were around about 1 billion people in Africa. By 2040, this will have doubled, and the UN estimates that by 2070, we will be at 3 billion people in Africa. So at around 2040, every 5th person on the world will be African. So what does that actually mean from a living perspective? You can see developing countries are even slightly going up in terms of people moving into cities. In Africa, it's even more significant because today, or around 2010, there were 36% of the population in Africa living in cities. And by 2030, it will be 50%. Think about, it's not just existing people, but even growing population that will need to live in cities. So from an enterprise perspective, companies, how are we going to deal with that? Because infrastructures need to be built. Yes, that can be an opportunity for enterprises, companies, to invest. But on the other hand, you cannot rely on an infrastructure that is there. So how do you actually deal with those everyday problems, starting from employees coming to work with load shedding, meaning you don't have power. Even now in Cape Town, where I'm living currently, we have water restrictions. So this is not something in the future, it actually starts today already when we look at that. And this will also change quite a bit of, like those mega cities will change the structure of the way of living of people in those cities coming from rural areas. Yeah, the whole infrastructure that needs to be built. Talking about Africa, just a quick snapshot of where are the biggest cities growing. And as I mentioned, every 5th person going forward, not too far to come, will be African. And most of them will live in cities going forward. Urbanization is a mega trend. I picked another one that I find very relevant for Africa, which is the scarcity of natural resources. Because the more people we have, the more resources we're going to need. And the Forum of the Future estimates that by 2050, humanity will demand twice as many resources as actually our Earth can supply. That sounds pretty frightening. Already by 2030, we need 50% more energy, 40% more water, 30% more food. How are we going to do that? And as an enterprise, again, we need to think differently. So how can we do with less more, starting from energy? So what kind of innovations do we bring forward to actually use less resources to have a bigger outcome? So reinventing ourselves with new materials, looking at to create energy with less. Mobility will be a huge one. If you have those mega cities, how you're actually making sure that the infrastructure works, from bringing food into those cities, bringing water into those cities, electricity. So huge challenges that actually, yes, government can look at, but in the end, those that will make it work will be enterprises with reinventing the way we do things today. One important part will also be the maritime resources that we have. Thinking about submarine mining or sub-maritime mining, desalination of water, and that's not really something for the future. It's already there with, for example, the Western Cape in South Africa, looking at how can we actually bring water to the people in Cape Town and surroundings. So it's real. The mega trends are there. And why I picked specifically the scarcity of raw materials is because I think the relevance of Africa is actually rising because of that. Because this continent has so much resources. And if there is an opportunity for the future, I think it's really there to grab it, and also for international companies to acknowledge that. So another one that is very important for companies is electricity, energy. So another mega trend is really the increasing demand of energy. And I'm not just talking about the quantity, but particularly also the quality. Because if we look at hospitals, if we look at telecommunication, you're not happy if your cell phone is not working, right? And we need energy, backup energy, etc., that actually keeps it going when there is a lack of energy. So looking at that, it's really looking not just at the quantity, which needs to significantly rise, but also the quality. Just one example out of Nigeria, where over a usual year, there is over 1,000 hours of power outage, unscheduled normally, so power just goes out without you knowing beforehand, and that normally brings up to 8% of the sales loss. So you lose a lot as a company because you don't have that infrastructure being very stable. When I came to South Africa in 2014, we had load shedding too. At least it was scheduled, so you knew when you are not able to cook, when you're not able to read a book in the evenings because there was no light. But it's reality today, and as an enterprise, you need to look at how are you going to deal with those things. But also on the other hand, it's how do you use that as a huge opportunity for your company to overcome those challenges. So, quick summary of the environment, and I really scratched the surface here in the short amount of time that we have together. It's really around, when we look at that huge population growth in Africa, Southern Africa, it's really changing the way of life going forward with the urbanization. We're going to see a lot of challenges within that VUCA world, where it is very volatile, uncertain, it's getting more complex, it's ambiguous, but this is where also the opportunities lie for enterprises as well to make a difference. So, talking about environment, I would like to introduce the Rolls-Royce leadership model. It has a part in it where obviously environment has an important part, so that's why I started with it. So this model comes from Pendleton and Cowell. It's called the primary color model, as you can see with the primary colors. And if you look at the upper part, the strategic domain, then we have the interpersonal domain and operational domain. So there are three major domains that model looks at. And you could say, well, it's the head with the strategic, the heart with the interpersonal, and the operational is the hand. And while I talked about the environment, This is really where, if you look at the strategic domain, you really need to understand in what kind of environment your company is dealing with. Because this is where you're setting not just the vision, but also the purpose for your company and what do you want to achieve as an enterprise. So looking very closely at that, it's around what kind of meaning and mandate you have within that environment that your company needs to deal in. So it's important to understand the external, the environment, to understand the demand that is pushed onto the enterprise from outside, but also, on the other hand, to understand what opportunities do I have. Adjacent to the strategic domain, you see on the one hand side the creating alignment, and on the other, planning and organizing. Looking at creating alignment, this is where the head meets the heart, or you can say the rational meets the passion, where it's really around bringing meaningfulness to the whole strategic thoughts that you put into the purpose of the company. So the planning and organizing, this is more where the head meets the hand, to really look at deadlines, to look at keeping the company at track. And keep that word deadline in mind, because from a cultural perspective, we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail in a minute. Coming to the delivering results in the operational domain, this is really where the work needs to work through to completion. This is where I like to say, the rubber hits the road, where things really happen. So you can have the greatest thoughts, but if you're never implementing, we're not going anywhere. So being part of an important part of the leadership. Looking at teamwork, very important. It's really where the magnitude or the sum of everything is more than the individual. Bringing it together, when you talk about leadership, you can lead yourself. That's the first important part, but more important is how do you get people together to work and bring something to a bigger scale. Then building, sustaining relationships, interpersonal. That will also be one of the important topics I want to discuss a little further in regards to a cultural perspective. This is really, you can say it in one phrase, is how does it feel to work for that company you're in? How are the relationships being built? How important are they? So I wanted to put that model there so we have something to go back to in our discussions in a minute, because this leadership model you can put anywhere in the world. However, how does it fit into culture? How do you need to amend and be flexible in that leadership model? Where do you need to put maybe more emphasis on in the different cultures we're working in today? So I want to another model, and then I'm done with models, I promise, is actually the Hofstede cultural dimensions. Looking at the 5, or Hofstede now talks even about 6 dimensions, I just wanted to make it quick in regards to the 5. The first one is really what you can see on the top in yellow is the low versus the high power distance. And what does that mean is that to what degree of inequality is accepted by a society. So the higher that score, the more the society kind of acknowledges that there is inequality, that there is, let's say, hierarchies. And for South Africa, as you can see, it's quite different to the German understanding, where there is a lot of acknowledgement of the power of a leader. Flat organizations, and that's a challenge because this is what we're driving for, flat organizations are actually quite challenging because there is not that much hierarchy. people, first of all, expect to be told rather than that they come up with things. So, and it's very general, I know that, but it gives a little bit of a feel for a culture. And particularly in South Africa, if you look at the apartheid and post-apartheid scores of those dimensions, you actually see a huge difference too. Because during apartheid, I would say you would mirror the German, where you can say there was only a very small population being accounted and looked at, while this one now really shows the majority of South African, which particularly shows the black culture. So looking at that, it's really around, being expected to be told, having like a boss you can look up to that tells you what to do. And those that know about Indaba might question, but how does that work? Because Indaba is a very important part of the South African culture, which means that you get consents through discussions. So it's a very important part of that culture. But even if you're discussing and trying to find consens, it's still on a very hierarchical basis. Age is very important in African cultures because it also shows the wisdom and the knowledge that you have and derived. So from that, also in families and enterprises, the expectation is a lot about hierarchy, and people are used to that. What I would like to highlight here, it's not part of that culture topic or the 5 dimensions, but time, because I think that's, we from a Western perspective have a very different feel for time or need for time. When we have a deadline, it's something very important we need to keep, and the more important things are, the closer are the deadlines, because it's so important we need to get it done quickly. On the contrary, in, let's say, African or Bantu cultures, the more important something is, the more time you need to spend on it. And actually, deadlines can be perceived as something quite intruding, because why do you not trust me? Why do you give me a deadline type of thing? So quite something to work with. If from your perspective you want to have things done very quickly, and deadlines are there to hold people accountable. On the other hand, you need to look at how do you deal with that cultural background where deadlines or important things need to be put into a time perspective that is very different to our time thoughts. Looking at the individualistic and collectivism, the green bar dimension. This is really where that shows the strength of ties that people have with each other in the community. So the higher, and this is where you can see the Germans tend to, is really where connections are more loose. So responsibilities are for the immediate family, maybe a little bit more of friends, but this is where it ends. Where if you look at the South African or Southern African cultures, the group is much more important. Strong group cohesion, it's a large amount of loyalty towards those groups that people spend. It's looking at, or the respect for people or members of a group is very, very important and very high. So part of that you might have heard about the Ubuntu culture or way of living in the last 2 days, and this is also where it's very much looking at, because I am because of you. That's the thought behind Ubuntu, and this is something not so easy to grasp for Western cultures, let's put it like that, because it puts you into let's say, a group, and because of the group, you are. While, let's say, on the individualism scale, it shows that there is a lot of need for freedom, a lot of need for individualism and expressing ourselves individually. So I think this is the biggest, let's say, gap or bridging we need to do within those two cultures. Let's look at the Western and the Southern African cultures. Are you surprised about the differences that you see on the score? No? Food coma has started? No. Okay, I'm going quickly through. I think the next one is one of the more similar ones between the masculine and the more feminine. And when we talk about feminine, it's not about that roles have changed or reversed. It's really more that the traditional male and female roles are more blurred. One of the lowest scores in the world is in Sweden with a 5, so meaning very on this side of the scale, where it's not unusual that women and men do the same jobs. And the further out you are on the masculine side, this way, the more there is still the traditional way of thinking around male and female roles. If a woman at all goes to work, then definitely in a different profession than men, to look at the very, very other end of the scale. So this is where I think we're very close. While I believe that seeing Germany, seeing the US, lived there, as well as South Africa, I feel that let's call it the female, depending on the culture, because it's multicultural South Africa, depending on that, are quite advanced to some areas. I can just make one example. While Germany is debating why would we have any quotas for a supervisory board, and I mean that's this many enterprises within Germany, and a huge debate about that. In South Africa, there is a drive of pushing and helping previously disadvantaged groups, and that goes back to apartheid, to actually give them more participation in economy. And part of that is those enterprises that want to deal in governmental related businesses, in tenders, etc., actually look at a scorecard, how well they do in transforming towards having previously disadvantaged groups participating. And women are part of that. So it's quite a drive, not just from an ethical perspective, but also from a gender perspective, to bring things in. So the debate in Germany, I actually need to sometimes laugh about, because that's so tiny in terms of what I can see elsewhere in the world happening, in terms of really driving towards more inclusion. Uncertainty, and then the long-term orientation as a quick one to wrap up the two models that I wanted to look at. In regards to the uncertainty, it's really around looking at to what degree a society gets anxious when there is new things coming up, to put it very blunt. The higher, the more a society wants to avoid, likes rules and regulations, because that feels safe and that feels we can control our destiny. The lower the score on this side, the more a society enjoys new events and likes to invent. So the higher the score, actually, the harder it is to also implement change, because that's new, that's uncertain. And obviously something not that easy to deal with. And then last but not least, how much the long-term orientation is really around how much a society values long-standing traditions. And that sounds a little strange that South Africa is that far down, because it is quite traditional. But I think in that regard, it looks very much onto the Asian side, where and Hofstede puts that out, that from a society perspective, let's say in the Asian cultures, there is a huge demand for keeping traditions. Yeah, with that, I would like to close out the two models, and I would like to merge them when we look at that. Because on the one hand side, we want to talk about leadership, the challenges that we're faced with, but also the success factors, but putting it into a cultural context of South Africa. I promise that I will make sure that you won't fall asleep, so I'm stopping to talk just now. I'll come back to that, because I would like to pose a little bit of a question and have you discussing that, so that we have a little bit of starting a Q&A and also having your input after 2 days. There might be a lot of thoughts there in the room. So after hearing, and yes, snapshots, but after hearing a little bit of my input, is what would you consider being a success factor? What do you think you would need to look after when leading an enterprise or being part of a leadership team in an enterprise in South Africa or Sub-Saharan African enterprise? So I would like you to not focus on the environment, the strategic domain. I would like you to think about, from an interpersonal perspective, what is important there. From a delivering results perspective, what is important there? We talked about deadlines, we talked about Ubuntu, we talked about numerous topics there. How do you make that work? And I can share, and I will share some of my thoughts, but I'm very curious to hear what, after 2 days hearing a lot. So what I'll invite you is to turn to your neighbor, 2 or 3 people, and just have a little bit of a chat. What do you take out of that? And I'll give you, let's say, 5 to 10 minutes, depending, I'll hear the energy in the room, if you still have enough to talk about. And we'll come back and talk then and bring it back. So let's actually get a little bit more into the question and answers, but actually more the input and also your input for the group, because I'm very curious, as I couldn't be here for the 2 days, to also hear what you have learned, where you see the connections, where you feel this is very important for enterprises to look at, to make sure that yeah, those enterprises are successful. So who would like to start? Can I rely on the last rows again?
There's someone who would like
perfect.
to start, yeah.
The first one is always the hardest, and then it...
Thank you for your speech also and for your input. But also keeping in mind what we were talking about the last 2 days and regarding the whole preparation, since I was part of the team, you've been talking a lot about differences, and transculturality is based more on commonalities. And we, in our group here, we agreed that it's of course important to know what's different between two cultures, between, for example, South Africa and Germany, but it is also really important to keep in mind what we have in common. So maybe know the differences, but being able to cope with them and focusing more on what we have in common, because when we only focus about what's different, we will never be successful. And the interpersonal domain we were just seeing would really suffer from focusing on differences. So maybe my question, what do we have in common with South Africa, and how difficult was it for you to focus on these commonalities instead of differences?
So I wouldn't say that it's about differences. I think it's more being aware of where cultures have their focuses, because there is no right or wrong in all of that. It's really around understanding where people that are part of the enterprise, the company, might come from a cultural background. That doesn't mean that there is a huge difference, because particularly in the interpersonal one, people are people. And as I said, the leadership model is something that you can put anywhere in the world. It's just, where do you need to put more emphasis on? So looking at, for example, the interpersonal one, you need to spend more time in that. That doesn't mean that's right or wrong. It's something where relationships and being part of a group is very important in the cultural context. So as a leader, you need to look at how much time do I spend there, as an example. Also, looking at the topic with deadlines, it's not right or wrong. If you feel like deadlines need to be there, or, well, there is a little bit more of a loose way of looking at time. You just need to be aware. So it's not a difference, I would call it. It's just the way how you need to acknowledge to work in a different culture and to bring it with that to success. Because if I'm only enforcing in terms of this is my way of looking at things, because I think this is the right way of looking at things, I won't be that successful. So I wouldn't call it the differences or the commonalities. It's really more how we as leaders interact in different cultures. And where do we put then the emphasis on the different domains that you see? Does that answer your question a little bit? Okay, cool. Any more comments, questions? I'm curious about your input as well.
You showed the graph with Germany and South Africa, and the graph looked like Germany is more towards male dominance than South Africa is. But the overall tone of the keynotes was that women in Africa are very disadvantaged. So how do you explain that?
So I'm not, and this one is looking at South Africa, and this is how a society sees themselves. And I mentioned what is called in South Africa broad-based black economic empowerment, where on the one hand side the previously disadvantaged groups are being looked at to participate more in economy, but that also includes the female. So because there was also quite a difference between female and male. And if you look at the scores during apartheid and now post-apartheid, it's actually quite a difference. Oh, sorry, I can put it up there again, where South Africa was much more on the masculine, so that has a little come down. And what I understand, and I'm also not the expert, is that females do have quite a role in African cultures. That doesn't mean that everything is equal. And from a scale perspective, it's still very much, let's say, it has a lot of room to go further down the scale. Yeah. This is how I would explain that. Yeah.
So would you also say that it's maybe linked with the diversity in the different African countries? So would there be also countries that would be more on the male side, or?
I think from that, I would even more call it the elderly have even, like, if you would like at a scale like that, because there are also what I experienced, and maybe that's more of a private, as my husband comes from Cameroon, it's also very, let's say the elderly being respected, rather than just looking at it from a male to female perspective. So the hierarchy from an age perspective has a much different gravity than in Western world countries. Yeah.
Thanks. Are there more questions or comments over here? Wait a second, we'll have a microphone passing over.
And I was thinking about success factors for leadership, and the concept of followership came into my mind. So
say it again?
Followership.
Mm-hmm.
So what brings people to follow you, to accept you as a leader? Mm. And I thought about that. For me, it would be basically getting things done, so that someone I would accept as a leader is taking responsibility in making things happen in whatever context that would be. And I would like to know now how you experienced this getting followership, as I think or I imagine you entered this new context of a company in South Africa, in Southern Africa, and had to gain followership, be accepted as a leader in that new team, in that new environment.
Looking at the leadership model, I think this is actually bringing it together. If I would only look at delivering results, we wouldn't get as a company anywhere. So where I started when I came to South Africa was really looking at, okay, what is our purpose as a company there in Africa? I mean, we can look worldwide. What does Rolls-Royce Power System do? But what do we do specifically in this context, in that environment? So looking at the strategy that we have and really putting out the vision for the company. So I think the first step that I felt very important to gain that leadership was creating alignment to stay with the wording. So people actually feel that they are part of a group and that they do feel commitment and want to follow because they feel this is the right direction. And it's, let's say, that combining the head with the heart to actually feel the passion for following that. Because then coming to the plans how to deliver on it, you do have the commitment, so people follow you, rather than that you need to push a plan onto them with deadlines, etc., but they are not convinced that this actually works. So I spend a lot of time in aligning and getting people on board to the common strategy, to the common, let's say, outlook. Yeah. This is where I felt I spent quite a bit of time to make it a success.